When you picture Jesus of Nazareth, you might envision a serene figure teaching by the Sea of Galilee, or a compassionate healer reaching out to the sick and marginalized. These images are accurate in many ways, as Jesus is indeed presented in the Gospels as the embodiment of love, mercy, and understanding. Yet the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, also contain episodes that reveal a more startling aspect of Jesus' character. These are moments where his words and actions are surprisingly forceful, challenging, or even unsettling for contemporary readers. We often focus on his messages of forgiveness, selflessness, and compassion, but neglect the instances where he demonstrates righteous anger, employs unsettling imagery, or confronts the religious status quo with language that is anything but gentle. By delving into these episodes with seriousness and an open mind, we gain a fuller picture of the complexity and depth of Jesus' mission. It can be humbling and eye-opening to recognize that the same individual who preached about turning the other cheek also spoke of swords, drove merchants out of the temple courtyard, and rebuked people, even his closest disciples, in ways that seem harsh by modern standards. Some of these stories are overshadowed by the more famous miracles and parables, which are often shared in sermons or Sunday school lessons. The calming of the storm, the feeding of the 5,000, the Beatitudes. These are timeless passages that emphasize Jesus' compassion and divine power. Yet, once you start examining the lesser-discussed moments with a dedicated eye, you begin to see that the Gospels themselves contain a multifaceted portrayal of him. The figure who blessed children and healed the blind is the same person who cursed a fig tree, cleared out the temple courts with zealous anger, and issued stern warnings about judgment and division. The tension found in these passages can be difficult to reconcile, especially if we have been taught only to see Jesus as endlessly patient and gentle. But these so-called hard sayings and shocking acts compel us to consider the seriousness of his message and the transformative demands of following him. One of the most talked about incidents that jar modern readers is the story of the cursed fig tree found in Mark's Gospel. Jesus, upon seeing a fig tree without fruit, utters a curse upon it, saying that no one will ever eat fruit from it again. Later, Peter notices that the tree has indeed withered. On its surface, this might appear like an impulsive outburst. Why would a loving teacher destroy a harmless tree? The key lies in the symbolic meaning within the Jewish context of the first century. Fig trees were often representative of Israel, and fruitlessness was seen as a metaphor for spiritual barrenness or lack of repentance. By cursing the fig tree, Jesus offers a visual parable. He demonstrates that appearances can be deceptive. A tree full of leaves but lacking fruit is analogous to a religious community or an individual that performs ritual or outward displays of piety yet lacks authentic righteousness or compassion. Although this symbolic reading helps clarify the episode, many still find it difficult because it reveals Jesus as someone capable of expressing anger and disappointment in a way that results in destruction, even if it is merely a tree. It's a moment that confronts us with the reality that he was not afraid to make a forceful point when it served a greater spiritual purpose. Another moment that showcases a more startling side of Jesus takes place within the temple in Jerusalem. This account appears in each of the four Gospels, although with some variations in detail and in the timeline of events. The essence of the story is consistent. Jesus enters the temple courts and finds them overflowing with money changers and merchants selling livestock and birds for sacrifices. The temple was considered the holiest place in Judaism, the very center of worship and ritual sacrifice. However, the outer courts had become a marketplace, cluttered with business deals and the exchange of currency. This situation was especially egregious to Jesus because, in his view, it polluted a holy site meant for prayer and reverence. He responds by driving out the sellers, overturning tables of money, and forcefully restoring a sense of sacredness to the place. Many translations describe how he made a whip out of cords, a detail suggesting a dramatic and possibly violent scene. This act stands in stark contrast to the image of a gentle rabbi preaching love and reconciliation. Instead, we see Jesus as a figure of righteous indignation, zealously defending the honor of God's house. For some readers, this comes as a shocking reminder that certain forms of anger, particularly those aimed at injustice or corruption, can be wholly justified. In the religious climate of his day, where many leaders profited from people's sincere devotion, his action was not just a random outburst, it was a direct challenge to institutional exploitation and hypocrisy. It underscores the idea that following Jesus involves more than just kindness. It can require confronting systemic issues, even if that confrontation is unsettling or disruptive. Moving on to some of Jesus' stark statements in the Gospels, one of the most puzzling is his declaration, "I have not come to bring peace, but a sword," found in the Gospel of Matthew. This line appears to undermine both the announcement of peace on earth at his birth and the title Prince of Peace, often associated with him. At face value, it sounds like a contradiction of everything we might expect from a messenger of love and compassion. Yet, the context reveals that this sword is more metaphorical than literal. Jesus warns his followers that their loyalty to him will bring division within families and communities. When people commit to his teachings, those who reject him or misunderstand his mission may oppose them, leading to conflict. It is a reminder that the revolutionary nature of his message cannot help but provoke controversy. Though the phrase is jarring, it highlights the idea that the gospel challenges existing power structures, traditions, and personal allegiances. Such challenges naturally create tension and conflict. In a world that often values comfort, the notion that devotion to Jesus might lead to turmoil within one's closest relationships can be deeply unsettling. Yet it's there in plain words, forcing believers to grapple with the reality that the path of discipleship can be both costly and divisive. Another startling passage arises in Matthew 15, when a Canaanite woman pleads with Jesus to heal her demon-possessed daughter. This scene seems to underscore cultural and ethnic tensions between Jews and Gentiles in first-century Palestine. At first, Jesus ignores her cries. His disciples urge him to send her away, presumably annoyed by her persistent pleas. When he finally addresses her, he mentions that his mission is primarily for the lost sheep of Israel. She persists, imploring him to help. He then uses a metaphor about food intended for children not being thrown to dogs, a term that appears demeaning and dismissive. In modern sensibilities, Jesus' words here can sound downright insulting, especially if we read them as reflective of cultural chauvinism. However, the woman responds with humility and faith, asserting that even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table, and Jesus praises her faith and grants her request. Scholars have debated whether Jesus was testing her persistence, mirroring the disciples' prejudices, or illustrating how faith transcends ethnic boundaries. Whatever the reason, the encounter is undeniably shocking. We see Jesus speak in a manner that is challenging and somewhat harsh, only to then commend the woman's deep trust in his mercy. It forces us to contemplate the complexities of his mission and the ways he simultaneously recognized cultural distinctions, yet also moved beyond them, ultimately blessing a Gentile woman in an extraordinary act of healing. A particularly intense moment occurs in Matthew 16, where Jesus rebukes Peter, one of his closest disciples, with the words, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter had just confessed Jesus as the Messiah, an act of profound insight and faith. Yet when Jesus explains that he must suffer and die, Peter objects vehemently. Jesus responds with this strong denunciation, equating Peter's misunderstanding with the very adversary who would seek to derail God's plan. It demonstrates that good intentions alone are not always in alignment with God's purposes. Peter likely meant well by opposing the idea of Jesus' suffering, but he was unwittingly placing himself in direct opposition to the divine mission. This exchange can be shocking because it reveals how quickly praise can turn to rebuke when one tries to reshape the Messiah's mission into something more palatable or less painful. It is not just a mild correction, it's an intensely forceful reprimand that situates Peter's stance in the realm of evil resistance to God's will. Such language reminds readers that Jesus' path to the cross was non-negotiable, a central component of his redemptive purpose. Anyone, even a beloved disciple, suggesting otherwise becomes an obstacle, and Jesus has no tolerance for that. There is another episode that often surprises readers when they encounter it in Luke's Gospel, where Jesus tells his disciples to buy swords if they do not already have them. The direction, "Let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one," is astonishing given Jesus' repeated teachings on nonviolence and loving one's enemies. The immediate context is that Jesus is warning his disciples about the perilous times ahead, particularly as his arrest and crucifixion draw near. Some interpret the statement metaphorically, suggesting he's advising them to prepare spiritually for the conflicts they will face. Others argue that Jesus is acknowledging the dangerous political situation surrounding his arrest, meaning the disciples might need to defend themselves against violent threats. Either way, the saying is abrupt and raises questions about whether there are circumstances under which defensive measures are warranted. Of course, just a short time later, when Peter attempts to use a sword during Jesus' arrest, Jesus tells him to put it away and even heals the man who was injured. The contradiction is palpable and highlights that Jesus' words about swords remain an area of ongoing theological debate. This tension reminds us that the Gospels sometimes preserve statements that do not fit neatly into a single uniform narrative about Jesus, which can be disconcerting for those seeking absolute clarity. But it is precisely in these challenging statements that we might learn the importance of discernment, context, and humility when interpreting Scripture. Another truly demanding statement comes from Luke's account, where Jesus says that anyone who wants to follow him must hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even their own life. At first glance, this is deeply troubling. Is Jesus advocating hatred of family, a command that runs contrary to the honor owed to parents and the general biblical exhortation to love one another? The typical scholarly view is that this statement is a form of hyperbole, a rhetorical device common in Semitic languages, which emphasizes that one's loyalty to Christ must exceed all other loyalties. That said, the language remains stark and unyielding, suggesting that discipleship is not merely an addition to normal life responsibilities, but a radical reorientation of one's entire existence. We are forced to reckon with the possibility that following Jesus might mean alienation or conflict with those closest to us if they oppose his mission. This passage aligns, in a startling way, with the earlier proclamation about bringing a sword and not peace. It underscores the sometimes painful truth that fidelity to Christ can disrupt family structures and cultural norms, demanding a level of commitment that, in comparison to other attachments, may appear as hatred. In Mark 5, we encounter the strange and disturbing event where Jesus casts a legion of demons out of a possessed man and allows them to enter a herd of pigs, which then rush into the Sea of Galilee and drown. For modern readers, this episode provokes questions about the nature of evil, the innocence of animals, and the economic implications for the herdsman who lost an entire herd of swine. Why would Jesus permit such a spectacle of destruction? In the world of the Gospels, this incident underscores his absolute authority over demonic forces. By sending the unclean spirits into unclean animals, Jesus symbolically demonstrates his power to liberate even the most tormented person from the clutches of evil. Yet we cannot ignore the shocking visual of thousands of pigs plunging into the water and perishing. For many, it challenges the gentle image of a benevolent teacher who heals and protects. It also begs the question of how the local community would have responded, as losing such a massive herd could have had dire financial consequences. The reaction in Mark's account is that the townspeople are terrified and beg Jesus to leave. The moment is profoundly unsettling and confronts us with a display of spiritual warfare that is dramatic, costly, and not easily reconciled with a sentimentally comforting view of Christ's ministry. It reminds us that the confrontation between good and evil can have real-world ramifications that are jarring. Perhaps one of the most startling episodes, at least in how it cuts against cultural expectations, occurs when someone approaches Jesus saying they will follow him, but first must bury their father. Jesus responds with the phrase, "Let the dead bury their own dead." In a culture that placed a high value on filial duty, honoring parents, and proper burial rites, this statement would have been scandalous. Even in modern times, it is difficult to imagine a spiritual leader telling someone that attending their father's funeral is less important than immediately pursuing a religious commitment. Scholars note that the phrase may be emphasizing the urgency of proclaiming God's kingdom above all other responsibilities. Yet it cannot be denied that it sounds callous to modern ears, and likely did in Jesus' day as well. The strong wording rips away any notion that Jesus' message is compatible with a half-hearted or merely convenient spirituality. It demands total dedication, to the point that even the most sacred familial duties might need to take second place to his call. This teaching can be deeply unsettling, especially for anyone who has lost a loved one or struggled to prioritize spiritual commitments alongside critical life responsibilities. It raises weighty questions about the cost of discipleship and whether we are prepared to let even our dearest obligations and attachments yield to Jesus' command. Finally, there is an entire discourse in Matthew 23, often referred to as the Seven Woes, where Jesus publicly denounces the religious leaders of his day. He calls them hypocrites, blind guides, and likens them to whitewashed tombs, clean on the outside but full of dead bones on the inside. He accuses them of burdening ordinary people with legalistic observances while neglecting justice, mercy, and faithfulness. This comprehensive verbal assault is startling, given that these were the respected authorities and pious practitioners of Judaism. Yet Jesus spares no harsh language in condemning their self-righteousness and hypocrisy. In modern religious contexts, such an unflinching criticism from a spiritual teacher might be interpreted as divisive or overly harsh. But it highlights that Jesus was willing to speak truth to power and was deeply angered by outward religiosity masking inner corruption. While it might seem shocking that he would deliver such an unrestrained rebuke, it demonstrates his profound commitment to genuine righteousness and compassion, and a rejection of empty, performative piety. The shock of these denunciations forces us to reflect on whether our own communities or religious institutions have fallen into similar pitfalls, focusing on externals while neglecting the heart of faith. All of these moments, cursing a fig tree, overturning the money changer's tables, proclaiming that he brings a sword rather than peace, seeming to insult a Gentile woman with an unflattering metaphor, harshly rebuking a beloved disciple, urging the purchase of swords, insisting that disciples should hate even their closest family, drowning a legion of demons in a herd of pigs, telling someone to let the dead bury their dead, and unleashing a scathing critique of religious leaders, might not fit neatly into the popular depiction of Jesus as endlessly gentle and affirming. Yet they are just as much a part of the gospel witness as the Beatitudes, the parables of grace, and the stories of miraculous healings. These episodes indicate that Jesus' mission was one of radical transformation that sometimes required confrontation, rebuke, and the exposure of falsehoods. He was never interested in a superficial religiosity that looked pious but lacked genuine heart transformation. Nor was he content to let oppressive systems or hypocrisy go unchallenged. To fully understand his person and message, we need to grapple with both the comforting and the unsettling dimensions of his ministry. By confronting these challenging passages head-on, we uncover a depth to Jesus that is often diluted when the focus is placed exclusively on certain beloved teachings or miracles. Far from negating his love or compassion, these shocking acts highlight the urgency and seriousness of what he sought to accomplish. At the same time, they challenge our preconceived notions, pushing us to consider that true love sometimes requires forceful truth-telling, that genuine peace can be preceded by conflict, and that real faith might demand jarring sacrifices and realignments in our priorities. The tension between the loving shepherd and the uncompromising prophet is not a contradiction, but a testament to the full humanity and divine mission of Jesus. He is not a one-dimensional figure, but a man who embraced the complexity of his calling. For many, discovering these episodes can be a turning point in faith. Some may be unsettled or even disturbed, feeling that the Jesus they learned about in childhood wasn't supposed to be so confrontational or extreme. Others may find solace and inspiration in seeing that he boldly confronted the root causes of injustice and hypocrisy, standing up for truth, even when it meant shaking the foundations of society. These stories can also correct overly sentimental depictions of him, reminding us that the call to discipleship is not merely about pleasant feelings, but about a life-altering commitment. The cost of following Jesus might indeed be high, and these passages do not let us forget it. They also assure us that Jesus was willing to stand against corruption, cleanse sacred spaces, and demand authenticity from leaders, all in the service of establishing a kingdom of righteousness and compassion. When we let these accounts resonate in us, we learn that the Gospels aren't just comfortable tales of miracles and moral lessons. They are confrontational narratives that challenge every generation to examine its own religious practices, social structures, and priorities. They remind us that genuine faith involves both tenderness and toughness, a compassion that heals and a zeal that refuses to tolerate injustice or pretense. If anything, these stories show Jesus' profound commitment to transforming hearts and societies, a process that inevitably disturbs the status quo. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that someone on a mission to change the world from the inside out might at times act in ways that catch us off guard. As you reflect on these 10 shocking acts, you might find yourself confronting difficult questions. How comfortable am I with a Jesus who disrupts business as usual in a sacred space? Am I ready to follow a teacher who sometimes uses language that strains cultural sensibilities? Do I really understand the cost of discipleship if I dismiss his warnings about division and radical commitment? Could there be moments in my own life where I must stand up for truth, even if it disrupts complacency or fractures relationships? Such self-examination is exactly what these passages seem designed to provoke. They compel us to go beyond a surface-level understanding of Jesus and wrestle with the implications of his life and words in every dimension of our own lives. Ultimately, these shocking moments do not cancel out the message of love and redemption at the heart of the Gospels. Instead, they complement that message by revealing the lengths to which Jesus was willing to go in order to awaken people to the reality of God's kingdom. If he were merely kind and nothing else, would his teachings have upended centuries of religious tradition or transformed people's lives in such a dramatic fashion? It's precisely because he combined mercy with zeal, compassion with confrontation, and gentleness with resolve that he made such an indelible impact on the world. In the end, understanding Jesus means holding these apparently disparate threads together in tension, recognizing that the same man who blessed children and wept for Jerusalem also dared to call respected leaders hypocrites, drive merchants out of the temple, and warn his followers of the conflicts ahead. Which of these stories strikes you as the most shocking or the most challenging? Does one incident in particular stretch your conception of who Jesus is? Reflecting on these questions can open new pathways for appreciating the profound complexity of his character and teachings. By meditating on both his comforting acts and his unsettling ones, we open ourselves to a fuller comprehension of the gospel message. This process might be uncomfortable, but it can ultimately deepen our faith, making it more robust, honest, and engaged with the real dilemmas and struggles of life. Exploring the unsettling side of Jesus equips us to relate to a world that is itself rife with conflict, injustice, and suffering, yet still in desperate need of redemption and a truth strong enough to shatter illusions and bring lasting transformation. If these narratives intrigue you, consider taking some time to read the Gospels in their entirety, focusing intentionally on the passages that make you uneasy. Look up historical and cultural commentaries for further insights. Listen to diverse theological perspectives that might shed more light on the reasons behind Jesus' actions. You may also want to discuss these texts in a study group or with a mentor who can help navigate the nuances. The goal is not to undermine Jesus' teachings about love, grace, and forgiveness, but to balance them with an awareness that he was also a figure of tremendous authority, intensity, and moral courage. Engaging with the more disquieting elements of the Gospels can lead to a faith that is both intellectually honest and spiritually vibrant. Though these episodes might rattle some of our assumptions, they also draw us into a deeper encounter with the Jesus portrayed in Scripture. He is not merely a passive sage imparting benign wisdom. He is a dynamic, sometimes formidable presence who demands radical change in human hearts and societies. It's in recognizing this fullness that we can truly appreciate the scope of his impact. Whether one ultimately views him primarily as a compassionate healer, a provocative prophet, or the incarnate Son of God, the reality is that his influence on history stems from the synergy of these roles. He was not afraid to love with abandon, nor was he afraid to raise his voice against those who distorted religious practice or exploited the vulnerable. He was not shy about calling individuals to leave behind everything for the sake of the kingdom. This zeal, which is undeniably shocking in certain moments, is precisely what has drawn countless millions to study his life and teachings across millennia. To this day, these shocking moments of Jesus raise conversations and debates among scholars, theologians, and believers. We find ourselves wrestling with the tension between grace and judgment, inclusion and holiness, mercy and justice. But in that wrestling is an invitation to transformation. If Jesus were simple and predictable, we would not be challenged to grow beyond our comfort zones. If he were merely a kindly teacher with no capacity for confrontation, his call to repentance might be easy to ignore. It's precisely the unsettling nature of these moments that can awaken a deeper reverence for the scope of his divine commission and the seriousness of his moral demands. In the end, taking these episodes into account enriches our understanding of Jesus rather than diminishes it. It compels us to see him not as a one-dimensional icon, but as a living, complex figure whose message continues to speak powerfully across cultures and centuries. It allows us to hold together his compassion for the weak and his anger toward injustice, his forgiveness of sinners and his condemnation of hypocrisy, his promise of comfort and his warnings of inevitable conflict. In that dynamic interplay lies the essence of his enduring challenge and appeal, calling every generation to a decision. Will we embrace the fullness of who he is, or will we seek to tame him by focusing on only the parts that confirm our preconceived notions? For those willing to engage the scriptures in their entirety, these so-called shocking moments become gateways to a faith that is as bold, searching, and transformative as Jesus himself.